James Stewart. Here's a question for you. When your life is nearly over, what do you actually remember? Not the awards, not the headlines, not the nights the whole world knew your name. If you ask people who lived through real fame and came out the other side, they almost never talk about the spotlight. They talk about the people who were standing next to them when it turned off. That was true for one of the most beloved actors Hollywood ever produced. A man who spent over 5 decades on screen, who flew combat missions in real wars, who played the everyman so convincingly that audiences forgot he was acting at all. By the time he was in his final years, he'd worked with nearly every legend of his era. But when people close to him talked about what he actually cared about, it wasn't the films, it was 5 people. 5 relationships that shaped him more than any script ever could. Stick with me, because this isn't really a story about Hollywood. It's a story about what's left over once the fame burns off. Margaret Sullivan. Long before either of them were famous, they were just 2 young actors trying to figure out how to survive in a business that chewed people up and spat them out. They met doing summer stock theater in the late 1920s, broke and hopeful, nowhere near the stars they'd eventually become. And from the beginning, there was something different about their connection. Not a Hollywood romance built for cameras, but a real friendship built on honesty. Margaret Sullivan was known in the industry for being blunt, sharp-witted, and completely unwilling to play the games that came so naturally to everyone else in town. She didn't flatter people, she didn't perform off-screen the way so many stars felt they had to. And that's exactly why he trusted her. Around her, there was no need to pretend to be anyone other than who he actually was. Their careers pulled them in different directions over the years. New contracts, new cities, new projects. The way Hollywood tends to scatter people. But whenever they crossed paths again, whether on a film set or at a dinner, it was like no time had passed at all. That's the thing about the friendships that actually matter. They're not built on how often you see each other. They're built on how easily you pick back up. She struggled with real difficulties later in life, and by most accounts, she carried them with more quiet dignity than the public ever knew. Success has a strange way of piling expectations on top of people, and by many accounts, that pressure weighed on her more heavily than most people realized at the time. Even so, those close to her described someone who kept giving to the people around her, right up until the end. When she passed away in 1960, it was, by the accounts of those who knew him, one of the losses that stayed with him the longest. Not because of the movies they made together. The 2 of them appeared on screen together only a handful of times. Because of who she was to him before any of that mattered. Long after her death, he was known to speak about her the same way people speak about a first true friendship, with a kind of tenderness that never faded, no matter how many decades passed in between. It's worth pausing on that for a second. Out of everyone he'd eventually meet, directors, co-stars, presidents, war heroes, one of the relationships he held on to most tightly was the one that started before he had anything to offer anybody. Before the fame, before the money, before any of it. Maybe that's exactly why it mattered so much. Henry Fonda. If you've ever met someone who didn't need to raise their voice to command a room, you already understand Henry Fonda. He and this actor became close friends in the early 1930s, long before either of them had a single major film credit to their name. In fact, for a stretch of time, they were roommates, 2 broke young men in New York, sharing an apartment, building model airplanes together, and talking about everything except the fame neither of them had yet. What people admired about Fonda wasn't just his talent on screen, which was considerable. It was his integrity off it. He wasn't the type to get swept up in his own headlines. Those who worked alongside him often mentioned the same thing. He treated the newest crew member on set with the same respect he gave a fellow Academy Award winner. No performance. No need to remind anyone who he was. The 2 men shared a passion for flying, and that bond outlasted every studio contract and every changing decade of Hollywood. Even later in life, when their politics sometimes pulled in different directions, and by most accounts, they did, the friendship itself never cracked. That says something. In an industry where relationships often dissolve the moment there's tension, theirs held. because it was never built on agreement, it was built on respect. When you strip away the awards and the box office numbers, what you're left with is a friendship that survived nearly 50 years, several decades of Hollywood changing shape around them, and enough disagreements to end lesser bonds. That's not luck. That's the kind of loyalty most people spend a lifetime looking for. There's a detail that tends to get overlooked in the highlight reels of both their careers. In their younger, broker years, they used to build model airplanes together at night, just to relax after long days of auditions and odd jobs. Such a small, unglamorous image, two future icons of American film, hunched over a kitchen table gluing balsa wood together. But it says more about the friendship than any award show photo ever could. That was the foundation. Everything after was just Hollywood catching up to who they already were to each other. Even when their political views diverged sharply later in life, and by most historical accounts, they genuinely did, neither man let it become a wall between them. They simply agreed to set it aside when they were together. That kind of maturity isn't common, especially not in a business built on public image and constant positioning. But it's exactly the kind of thing that tends to define a friendship built on something deeper than convenience. John Wayne. Now, most people picture John Wayne as larger than life. The voice, the walk, the towering presence that filled a movie screen without even trying. That image wasn't wrong exactly, but the men who actually knew him tended to describe someone a little different. A man who valued loyalty above almost everything else, and who never seemed interested in the constant ranking and comparing that Hollywood loved to do. The two of them worked together and crossed paths at industry events for years, and by every account, Wayne treated newcomers on a set with the same energy he gave established stars. Fame changes a lot of people, sometimes without them even noticing it's happening. Those who spent real time around Wayne often said it never seemed to change him much at all. What stood out most, according to people who were there, wasn't how much he talked, it was how well he listened. The public image was of the loudest man in the room. The private reality, according to those close to him, was someone who paid close attention to the people around him, especially the ones who'd been there before the fame arrived. That kind of loyalty is rare in any profession, but it's especially rare in one built on image and reinvention. If John Wayne considered you a friend, by most accounts, he stayed your friend, through career highs, career lows, and everything in between. That's not the stuff of headlines, but it's the stuff people actually remember. Think about how many working relationships in Hollywood are transactional at their core, built around a project, useful for exactly as long as the project lasts, and quietly forgotten once the cameras stop rolling. That wasn't how Wayne operated, at least according to the people who spent real time with him off set. He remembered names. He remembered details about people's families. He remembered who'd helped him back when he was still a nobody trying to break into pictures, and he never seemed to forget it, no matter how big his own name eventually became. There's something almost old-fashioned about that kind of consistency, and maybe that's exactly why people who knew him talk about it so fondly. In a town built on reinvention, he was, by every account, remarkably the same person on his worst day as he was on his best one. That's not something a publicist can manufacture. That's just character. Grace Kelly. Grace Kelly arrived in Hollywood with a kind of effortless elegance that made her an instant icon, the kind of presence that belonged on a magazine cover before she'd even done much film work. But the people who actually knew her tended to bring up something different first: how genuinely curious she was about other people. In an industry built around talking about yourself, Grace Kelly was known for doing the opposite. She asked questions. She wanted to know about your family, your worries, your life outside of the next project. And she listened in a way that made you feel like, for a few minutes, you were the only thing that mattered in the room. That's a rare quality anywhere. It's an especially rare one in Hollywood. When she left acting to become Princess of Monaco in 1956, the world treated it like the ending of a fairy tale. And from a distance, it certainly looked like one. But those who kept in touch with her afterward often said the same thing. The title didn't change who she was. She remained warm, down to earth, and remarkably unimpressed by her own new circumstances, even while carrying responsibilities most people could barely imagine. Her death in 1982, in a car accident in Monaco, was a loss that stunned people well beyond the film industry. But for those who'd actually known her personally, what stayed with them wasn't the crown or the palace. It was a woman whose kindness never depended on who was watching. There's a particular kind of grace that only shows up in people who never had to fight to be noticed. Grace Kelly was, by nearly every account, one of the most photographed and admired women of her generation. And yet she never seemed to lean on that. If anything, those closest to her said she seemed almost uncomfortable with the amount of attention her image attracted, and far more interested in the substance behind other people's lives than in the spotlight around her own. That's a rare kind of humility to hold on to, especially once your face is recognized on nearly every continent on Earth. It takes a certain steadiness of character to keep asking other people about their lives when your own life has become the subject of magazine covers and royal biographies. She kept doing it anyway, right up until the end. That consistency is exactly why she's remembered so warmly by the people who actually got to know her, rather than just the public who admired her from a distance. Gloria Hattrick MacLean. And then there's the one relationship that, by every account, outweighed all the others. He met Gloria Hattrick MacLean in 1949, at a dinner party. She wasn't from the industry, wasn't chasing fame, wasn't impressed by any of it. They married that same year, and it lasted for 45 years, until her death in 1994. In an industry famous for short marriages and constant reinvention, that number alone tells you something. By all accounts, what made the relationship work wasn't excitement or drama. It was steadiness. She didn't measure his worth by how a film performed at the box office, and she didn't treat his career as the most interesting thing about him. Home, for him, became the one place where the noise of Hollywood simply didn't reach. Those who knew the couple often described the same thing: an ordinary domestic life, full of quiet evenings, shared dinners, and the kind of comfortable silence that only exists between people who've truly settled into each other. Nothing about it made headlines, and that seemed to be exactly the point. When people who study his life are asked what mattered most to him in his later years, the answer is almost always the same. Not a specific film, not a specific award, just home, just her. A 45-year marriage that outlasted nearly every trend, contract, and studio system Hollywood ever produced. What it all adds up to. Here's the pattern. If you step back and look at all 5 of these relationships together, none of them were about status. None of them were about who could be seen with whom. A blunt, honest friend from before the fame started. A quiet, loyal companion who never needed the spotlight to himself. A famously loyal friend who valued consistency over headlines. A princess who never stopped genuinely caring about ordinary people. And a wife who chose steadiness over spectacle for 45 straight years. Take away the movies, the war record, the decades of stardom, and what you're left with is a much simpler story. The same one that applies to basically anybody, famous or not. A life well lived isn't measured by how bright the spotlight was. It's measured by who stuck around after it dimmed. So here's the real question worth sitting with. Who are the 5 people you'd point to if someone asked you the same thing? Not the ones who showed up when things were going well, the ones who stayed when they weren't. Take a second and actually think about it. Chances are, you already know the names. If this kind of story hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor, like it, drop a comment with the name of someone who belongs on your own list, and subscribe for more stories like this one. Because at the end of the day, none of us are remembered for the applause. We're remembered for the people who loved us quietly, the whole way through.